Proverbs begins with a reference to King Solomon, refers to him again in chapters 10 and 25, notes King Hezekiah's efforts to collect wisdom literature, and includes numerous proverbs about the king, his rule, his messengers and officials, his court, and decisions. Therefore, it's not surprising to find that Proverbs ends with a short literary unit giving counsel to the king. In fact, I tie it together with Agur in this way. As Agur's words provide counsel for the commoner, King Lemuel's words give advice to those in authority, so that whether high or low, important or not, rich or poor, Proverbs contains wisdom for all levels of society. Let's turn to chapter 31 of Proverbs for our last study in this series. The 8th literary unit of Proverbs is clearly marked by a beginning superscription, verse 1, and then continues through verse 9. The superscription or title says, "The sayings of King Lemuel, an oracle his mother taught him." As a student of wisdom, we are inclined to ask, who is King Lemuel? He's not listed among the kings of Israel or Judah. When and where did he reign? Who is his mother who gave him this teaching? Lemuel's origin, history, mother, and place of rule are all unknown, though some scholars have tried to associate him with the king of Edom, Israel's traditional neighbor nation to the south. This suggested connection is based more upon theories than solid evidence. Some scholars suggest this unit comes from a foreign source because of its similar content to Egyptian wisdom teaching for royalty on how to govern wisely. Additionally, there are no other examples of advice in the Bible given by a queen mother to her son, the king. This section is unique in the Bible. However, the style of writing in this unit is distinctly Hebrew and very similar in principle and literary technique to other units in Proverbs. Whether or not the advice is foreign, most scholars agree that Hebrew writers have definitely shaped the content. The sayings of King Lemuel in chapter 31 cover verses 1 to 9. The counsel his mother gives him can be divided into 4 distinct categories of advice. The 4 topics include sexual purity, self-control, financial diligence, and social justice. Let's look at these 4 topics more closely. First, sexual purity. Verse 3 says, "O my son, O son of my womb, O son of my vows, do not spend your strength on women, your vigor on those who ruin kings." Notice Lemuel's mother addresses her son in a threefold salute. She identifies Lemuel as her son socially, her son biologically, and her son legally. Without mentioning it directly, the queen mother has already underscored the importance of his keeping marriage vows and building a family upon that legal foundation. His mother is an example for him to follow. Her advice is clear and succinct and appears as a synonymous proverb where the second line means the same thing as the first, but with different descriptive words. Do not spend your strength on women. Obviously, this would be in the context of illicit affairs or even the accumulation of many wives. This advice echoes the words of the father in his 5th speech to the son in chapter 5, verses 9 and 10. He warns his son to avoid the prostitute, lest you give your best strength to others and your years to one who is cruel, lest strangers feast on your wealth and your toil enrich another man's house. In this context, sexual promiscuity robs the king of his energy, wealth, and attention to royal matters. Such a diversion will most assuredly bring a king to ruin. For any student of wisdom, King Solomon's own sexual exploits could be a spiritual and royal illustration for King Lemuel's counsel. 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 to 13 summarizes God's view of Solomon's sexual adventures. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter: Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from the nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen." Solomon's personal history stands as an alarming reminder that King Lemuel's practical wisdom is shaped by solid human experience that has a harsh, bitter result to it. The young Jewish men sitting in the classroom, perhaps even in exile because of Israel's sin, would be able to personally resonate with this wisdom. The second point of counsel for King Lemuel is to avoid beer and wine. Listen to his mother's advice. "It is not for kings, O Lemuel, not for kings to drink wine, not for rulers to crave beer, lest they drink and forget what the law decrees and deprive all the oppressed of their rights." Humans are well aware of the negative features of alcoholic beverages. Beer and wine cause a person to lose their finer motor skills, impairs their judgment, slows reactions, blurs vision, undermines self-control and wise choices, promotes a loss of inhibitions, and in the severest cases brings unconsciousness and even memory loss. The point Lemuel's mother underscores for her kingly son is that beer and wine will have a tremendously negative influence on his kingship. They will make him forget. The emphasis of her counsel is on the king fulfilling his responsibilities. He should not drink beer or wine because it will cause him to forget his own decrees and rule unwisely. I believe the same argument should be made for all civil leaders, and especially church leaders. The third point of advice is found in verses 6 and 7. The Scriptures say, "Give beer to those who are perishing, wine to those who are in anguish. Let them drink and forget their poverty and remember their misery no more." Before I get into the point about giving beer and wine to the poor, let me point out that the underlying principle or advice given to the king is generosity. Instead of the king spending the kingdom's wealth to indulge his personal fleshly desires, which in the end ruins his ability to govern fairly, the king should instead share his wealth with the poor. This helps avoid the trap that beer and wine represent, and instead encourages the king to remember the less fortunate with his riches. Some who do not understand the Hebrew way of writing will argue Proverbs commands that we should give beer and wine to the poor so they can forget their troubles. In reality, the writer has developed a chiastic poem balancing the following elements of this passage as follows. The chiastic structure places the forgetting qualities of beer and wine as the central characteristic that touches upon both examples of use. If the king drinks beer and wine, it has a negative influence upon him. It will cause him to forget his laws and rule unfairly. The same forgetful quality of beer and wine is minimized among the poor who have no such kingly responsibilities. The beer and wine that the king should avoid could make the poor forget their troubles. Thus, this chiastic structure uses beer and wine to poetically balance out the argument that the king, the primary target of the teaching, should share his wealth with the poor. It does not promote drinking and forgetting by the poor people of a society. Such a promotion would go against many other proverbs already contained in this book, especially the longer saying in chapter 23, verses 29 to 35. The fourth and final point of advice from Lemuel's queen mother concerns social justice. She encourages her son to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up, judge fairly, defend the rights of the poor and needy. Without doubt, the poor and destitute often find themselves without voice or power within any government. They need an advocate. Lemuel's mother insists the king should be the advocate for his poorest subjects. He should defend their rights, judge fairly, and defend those who are at the mercy of others. Such social justice is at the very heart of God's concern for His people and the community within which they live. God detests unfair courts, corrupt officials, and those who take advantage of the widows, orphans, and strangers in the community. He condemns those who use false weights, withholds grain, sets high prices, and is not generous to his neighbor. And God's agent to exercise fair judgment, promote social justice, and build community stability is his earthly representative, the king. I believe Proverbs concludes with words of wisdom to the commoner and the king alike. Wisdom is not just for one social strata, but for all. The wisdom of Proverbs will safely guide both poor and rich, young and old, educated and non-literate, weak and lowly, and the mighty kings and their officials. Those who seek wisdom with all their hearts, value it more than silver and gold, internally gain it and not let it go, will stand in right relationship with God and neighbor and enjoy the most successful life possible. Finally, the book of Proverbs ends with a very interesting poem. It's called The Wife of Noble Character, though no superscription appears in the original text. The title has been added many years later. Scholars often identify this as the ninth and last literary unit of Proverbs. Probably no other portrait in all literature has depicted so clearly and comprehensively the qualities of a good woman and the ideal wife, at least in Hebrew thought. At the same time, perhaps no other Bible passage has brought more anguish and guilt for Christian women than this ending unit of Proverbs. Books have been written on this passage, and many seminars have been conducted. However, I seek to provide a different interpretation or emphasis to the Proverbs 31 woman. I wish to give an alternative understanding of what Proverbs is seeking to accomplish with this poem and how that affects our interpretation of this teaching on a woman of noble character. First, let's read the poem. A wife of noble character who can find? She is worth far more than rubies. Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. She selects wool and flax and works with eager hands. She is like the merchant ships bringing her food from afar. She gets up while it is still night. She provides food for her family and portions for her female servants. She considers a field and buys it. Out of her earnings she plants a vineyard. She sets about her work vigorously. Her arms are strong for her tasks. She sees that her trading is profitable. In her hand she holds the distaff and grasps the spindle with her fingers. She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. When it snows, she has no fear for her household, for all of them are clothed in scarlet. She makes coverings for her bed. She is clothed in fine linen and purple. Her husband is respected at the city gate, where he takes his seat among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them, and supplies the merchants with sashes. She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. She speaks with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. She watches over the affairs of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children arise and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Many women do noble things, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceptive, and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Honor her for all that her hands have done, and let her works bring her praise at the city gate. We cannot see it in English, but this final literary unit of Proverbs is actually an acrostic, alphabetical poem that many scholars say praises the wife's contribution to her husband and children. Each line of the poem begins with a new letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Her worth is based upon her ability to manage her household affairs, work hard, do business, purchase land, show kindness to the needy, enhance her husband's standing in the community, and fear the Lord. The poem also has verbal markers that show the beginning and ending of the poem. The words noble character, verse 10 and 29, and husband, verses 11 and 28, are found at the beginning and then again in reverse order at the end. This forms an inclusio, or picture frame, designating a distinct literary unit, an independent piece of wisdom. The poem divides into 2 units of 9 verses each, verses 10 to 18 and verses 21 to 29. The 2 units balance each other and share 14 repeating phrases that emphasize the power of the poem. Some of these common phrases include the wife's incomparable qualities, her husband, excellence in morals and speech, expertise in handiwork, management of the household, success at commerce, and industry and hard work. Interestingly, verses 19 and 20 contain a chiasm, separating the 2 units. The Hebrew words for hand and palm are variously translated, making the structure less clear in English. However, the chiastic form does appear to be intentional in its wording and placement. Let's read the 2 verses together to get the flow. In her hands she holds the distaff and grasps the spindle with her fingers. She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. The word translated in English as fingers and arms would be more closely translated from the Hebrew as palm. This creates a much more tightly knit literary structure. In the first verse, the hand palm grasps and holds. In the second verse, the palm hand opens and extends. The first emphasizes work. The second emphasizes generosity to others. In other words, this woman of noble character takes care of her own household and works hard enough to care for the disadvantaged in the community. The summary statement to this poem, verses 30 and 31, repeats the key word praise, which is the earned reward of the industrious woman. This section wisely concludes that a woman should not be praised for her grace, which is deceptive, and beauty, which is vain, but for her fear of the Lord, which leads her to perform good deeds for her family and the needy. After all, we learned about the fear of the Lord in the very first chapter, chapter 1, verse 7. It is the beginning of wisdom. Some scholars argue over the purpose of this unit, and they suggest at least 3 different reasons. It is a heroic song praising the wise woman of the house. It is an instruction manual for younger women about to get married. It is a description of an ideal, wise wife that young men should follow to find their wives. While the poem seems to describe a noble wife, I do not believe this is the primary reason for its inclusion in Proverbs. Let me first give a few difficulties with the poem's purpose. If this poem is instruction for women about to wed, then it seems totally out of context and place for the book. If Proverbs was used as a school book for young men being taught by the fathers, then one last section teaching young women seems out of place within the entire book. Why change the focus of the book from the young men to young women in the very last section? On the simplest level, the acrostic poem describes a wise wife or life companion. This parallels the father's encouragement to his son in the early speeches to avoid sexual temptation of the prostitute and to find and cling to the wife of his youth. This teaching would be an excellent guide or manual for young men to use in finding that good wife. Such an interpretation fits better with other teaching in Proverbs. However, it seems more likely and consistent that the writers and editors of Proverbs have a more cohesive, more important structural intent. Let's review some points about the book of Proverbs before I put forth my conclusion concerning the acrostic poem of the wife of noble character. First, the purpose for the book of Proverbs as listed in the purpose statement says, for gaining wisdom, chapter 1, verse 2. This is the intended primary focus and final goal for all who would study these Proverbs. The proper orientation or attitude for gaining wisdom is to fear the Lord. This is the very beginning or essence of wisdom. The first 8 chapters of Proverbs contain speeches from the father to his son. He encourages the young man to search diligently for wisdom, saying, "Turn your ear to wisdom and apply your heart. Indeed, call out and cry aloud. Look for wisdom as for silver and search for it as for hidden treasure." Most importantly, wisdom is personified as a woman who calls out and seeks those who love her. She says, "I love those who love me, and those who seek me find me." For those who hear her call and come to her, she says, "I will pour out my thoughts. I will make known my teachings." Wisdom speaks of the blessings she brings to those who love her and stay with her. Counsel and sound judgment are mine. I have insight. I have power. With me riches and honor, enduring wealth and prosperity. For those who find me find life and receive favor from the Lord. The father tells his son, wisdom's worth is greater than silver and gold and rubies, and that wisdom will save you from the ways of the wicked men. Chapter 9 of Proverbs presents a problem. Wisdom, as a young woman, seeks companions who would accept her gifts and the life she has to offer. However, folly also calls out to potential companions, and her call sounds very similar to wisdom's. How can young men tell the difference between the two women? Even more, how can we identify which path to follow so that we avoid folly and end up in wisdom's house? Chapters 10 to 30 of Proverbs are set up to contrast and illustrate the differences between wisdom and folly. These chapters use various structured proverbs, synthetic, antithetic, synonymous, couplets, better, simile, numerical sayings, and example stories to effectively illustrate and teach the right path to wisdom's house. By chapter 31, the search for wisdom is over. The student has found her and become her companion. He now lives in her house and enjoys the blessings she brings. I believe the acrostic poem illustrates wisdom as a faithful wife and the skilled woman of her household. She is not a lofty, remote ideal for mystery seekers. Instead, wisdom is a lifelong companion who brings tremendous blessings to those who choose to live in her house, including praise from others at the gates of the city. It is unclear whether or not the average Hebrew woman held the cultural responsibilities of purchasing land or planting a vineyard as described in chapter 31, verse 16, or that she was responsible for all the things attributed to the wife of noble character. However, women have traditionally used this poem as a manual to describe the traits and actions of an ideal wife. Again, I don't believe this is the primary goal of the poem. Nor do I believe this poem is included in the book of Proverbs just to provide teaching for wives. I have taught this entire series on the belief that Proverbs have more than one level of meaning. There is an apparent surface or top layer of meaning that is fairly evident to even the shallowest reader. Then there are deeper layers that are intended to draw in the more serious student of wisdom. The top layer of this acrostic poem appears to be the ideal characteristics of a noble wife, at least in the context of ancient Hebrew culture, and what the son should look for. However, a deeper, more contextual interpretation exists. This final literary section reveals all the blessings a successful young man may enjoy when wisdom becomes his faithful companion in his home and throughout life. It is a successful climax to this book on wisdom. The student has gained wisdom and is enjoying her benefits. Notice also that there is an inclusio phrase of fear the Lord that begins and ends the book of Proverbs, chapter 1, verse 7, and chapter 31, verse 30. Thank you for joining me in this study of one of the greatest books on wisdom. It has stood the test of time for over 3,000 years. It's worthy of our continued attention and study. I hope this series has not satisfied your interest in Proverbs, but will only cause you to dig deeper into its chapters. There is much hidden treasure to uncover and learn. We must seek wisdom and find our place in her house. So let's get started. Until next time.